We move on now, and commanding the narrative, ladies and gentlemen, has become one of the most valuable currencies of our time, shaping markets, influencing public perception, and determining which ideas rise and which fall. So it's time now to unpack what it really means to seize the narrative command in an era of information overload. And who better to guide us through this very subject than someone who has very much lived at the intersection of mobility, of media, and innovation. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to Alex Roy, General Partner at New Industry Venture Capital. A very warm welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's an honor to come here to the Kingdom and talk about this concept which has consumed my life. In my prior life, before starting New Industry Venture Capital, I was a journalist and I had a media company, and I was always fascinated by the phenomenon of how one company would dominate the discourse regardless of its technological progress or the status of its fundraising. One company always did this. And this was such a peculiar thing as a journalist to have, every interview, one company would always come up no matter what anyone wanted to talk about. And so in the years since, I thought, wouldn't it be fascinating to scientifically deconstruct how one company can accomplish this? So this phenomenon is easily identified because when you enter into a conversation, and no matter what you say as an investor or as a founder, the person across the table says, yeah, but what about company X? Even if you know company X sucks, that company always comes up, and it almost becomes impossible to exit that conversation without being on the defensive the entire time. So this concept, this phenomenon I call narrative command. And by understanding it and deconstructing it, it becomes possible to counter it and seize it as a startup, even as a venture capital firm, and I believe also on the global stage. So narrative command, from a startup perspective, makes it possible to absolutely put anyone else on the defensive. You can recruit, you can raise money, and even when you're not in the room, your narrative dominates the narrative of everyone else who's in that vertical. And so when you think about it that way, you realize that 99% of marketing and communication spend by almost anyone is a complete waste, because people consider marketing and communications a tool set. It's a line item. We put out so many press releases a week. We have so much messaging we get out into the world. We put our CEO or leader on stage. If they speak the talking points, the job is done. Not true, because getting those jobs done is not a strategy. These are tactics and tools against a competitor or nation state that has a clear vision for what their narrative should be and looks at that as a strategic goal. So this chart represents the companies, at least in the US and Western markets, that possess narrative command in their subverticals. Tesla is the most obvious one, but they exist in AI, they exist in ride-hailing, in real estate, in Redwood Materials is in recycling. And if you enter into a conversation, at least in the West, in any of these subverticals, these are the default companies every single time. Even if they are not the best, they become the best by virtue of their narrative owning every conversation. So let's deconstruct how Tesla established narrative command. First, they had the first master plan, which was 19 years ago. And this master plan superseded Tesla's own goals to define what they believe the narrative should be for the entire sector of automotive manufacturing. They didn't say, we're going to make the best cars next year, 5 years, 10 years from now. They said, this is how everyone will make cars. The Tesla master plan, which defined their narrative, became the default narrative for what everyone in the sector had to do if they wanted to be competitive. No one in the West understood this, but the Chinese did and duplicated it successfully. So the second component of narrative command for Tesla was the release of a seminal product. Today, we all know what a Tesla Model S is, and reviewers would say the Model S is a little old now. But in what it was at the time it came out, absolutely the seminal product. And to this day, even though other car companies have released cars which are, in theory, better in some aspects. I'm a big fan of Lucid. I've driven a Lucid. I love Lucids. Rivian's a great vehicle. But neither Rivian nor Lucid have surpassed Tesla in all 6 of the elements which made the Model S a seminal product. So, the third component of Tesla's narrative command is the definition of default market language. On the right, you will see all of the terminology used by everyone else in EV and AV, anywhere in the world. On the left, you will see the terms that Tesla uses. So simple, so simple. And yet, no one else on Earth, including the Chinese OEMs, have succeeded in using language as simple and obvious as Tesla. Walk into a car dealership, and I guarantee you that every salesman will use the terminology on the right, which leads people who have owned Teslas or are curious about Teslas to walk into a car dealership and say, "Oh, Mercedes, do you have autopilot?" "No, we have level 2++. No one has a clue. Even the salesman doesn't know what these things mean. The fourth component, this is critically important to understand, is the degeneticization of language and the regeneticization of language to Tesla's own benefit. Autopilot was invented over 100 years ago by Sperry, an American. Sperry, coincidentally, he was killed using autopilot. That doesn't matter because autopilot for more than half a century was the default term for what planes do when a pilot's not paying attention. There are under 1 million people in the world who can fly a plane, who even know how an autopilot works. And yet, people for almost a century believe that planes, ships, and just things in general work autonomously if there's an autopilot installed. Tesla looked at this generic term and said, "We'll make it ours." They announced Tesla Autopilot. This is about 10 years ago. It became the default language for the assumption that a vehicle is autonomous. It's not. And yet people assume that it is. In the years since Tesla did this, no one successfully countered that conflation of language, that use of a generic term, and it's almost kidnapping by Tesla. And to the point now where autopilot has become generic again, but Tesla owns it, which makes no sense logically or technically, but narratively, perfect sense. And this is true of the other 5 terms on the left, which Tesla now owns as well. By the way, Waymo, which is the reality command leader of autonomy in the West, does not ever use the word robotaxi. Tesla uses it. What do people use to talk about Waymos? They use robotaxi, a word Tesla owns. So the next component is the activation of allies. If you have stakeholders, whether it's investors or customers who love you so much they will do the job of your marketing team for you, you can literally spend less money to maintain your narrative command because it is an amplificatory strategy to have your stakeholders do the job for you. As a result, Tesla shut down their public marketing team, and now the stakeholders do it for them, which is extraordinary. It's laughably powerful. And the final component is the charismatic leader. You don't have to like Elon Musk to recognize that he absolutely understands how to do this task. And so every time he speaks on any topic, it supports his brands across the board. So these 6 components form a narrative command box. You don't have to execute all of these components, and there are other components one can use to build narrative command. But once you start constructing the elements of the box, start with just 1 or 2 or say 3, every conversation that occurs in that vertical pits any company that wants to talk about that vertical against bouncing off the sides of that box. And if you could assemble a box of 4 or 5 walls, it becomes impossible to escape it. Every competitor, every investor, every conversation occurs inside your box. I estimate that the value of Tesla's narrative command is $150 billion. And it's going up, not down. Going up, which is unbelievable. Let's deconstruct the dynamics of narrative command. So, inspired by Maslow's pyramid of self-actualization, created this pyramid. And it is a very slippery slope because if you are the first player in your vertical, it is very inexpensive. It is quite easy to seize narrative command because there's no one to fight against. If everyone else in the vertical, legacy, is spending money on marketing communications as tools and checkboxes, and you're arriving with one goal, I want narrative command, you will seize it. And if anyone follows you, they cannot displace you because unless you have a catastrophic corporate disaster, you're going to keep it until the market is mature. The market is mature when multiple players have narratives that cannot supersede the others. In the US auto and global aviation market, this is what you have. There's nothing Airbus or Boeing can do, including plane crashes, that can get either of them above the other. They are at equilibrium. In US robotaxi, it's quite fascinating because Tesla has narrative command, Waymo has reality command, but Waymo still cannot displace Tesla. They cannot, because everyone who talks about Waymo uses Tesla language. And there's also implicit in the use of Tesla at every story that they're about to execute. They've been about to execute for years. The best Waymo could hope for, and it's a great product, I use it every day, I live in Arizona, is equilibrium. This is what it's going to look like sometime next year. Tesla only has to deploy a few driverless cars, and they will achieve this, in which case they've won because they had narrative command and $150 billion of valuation added to the company for 10 years to get to equilibrium. And Waymo will never be able to displace that. Global superpowers. Let's talk about this on a world stage. I was asked to discuss the American election a few years ago in the context of narrative command, and I began thinking about it. It was quite obvious, if you look back at history, who has had it and who has not, and what the dynamics are and how they apply both from startups to nation states. Obviously, for half a century, this was the narrative command equilibrium between the United States and the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union evaporated, this is it. This is it by default, because there was no one else to come in and displace American soft power or hard power. Now it gets interesting. When Trump was elected in 2016, and this was true about 4 months before he was elected, I went to a car meet. I love cars. I know I have many friends from Saudi who loves cars. You go to a car meet, and you pay close attention to what people are wearing at the car meet. I saw my first MAGA hat at a car meet in 2016. I'm like, this is interesting. This is very odd, but I see something I had not seen before, and it became apparent in the years since that Trump seized complete and total narrative command of the political discourse in the US. There was no one in the other party who could show up and say anything without it being put in the box that Trump had created. And the box consists of these phrases, which you don't have to be American, you don't have to like Trump, you don't need to know anything about what he thinks about anything to know that these phrases are incredibly, brilliant simplifications of complex concepts and goals. And to this day, no one in the United States has displaced any of these terms or phrases, which will make it very difficult for anyone to defeat his party in the future, even when he's not running for office. Now let's apply this to the future. It is very clear now, I'm an American, I love my country, but it's very clear that this is the state of narrative in the world today. Regardless of what friends of mine want to say back home, America is so great. This is the reality, and anyone who knows math and economics and investing and technology and travels and comes to Saudi knows this is true. Knowing this is true, what happens in the future? At some point, soon, 2030 maybe, the narrative equilibrium is going to change because the United States and China will not be the only countries that have extraordinarily important narratives that countries and startups and investors will use to make their decisions for the future. So, in the past, people used the word global multipolar. I think it's going to be a global multi-power. And it's going to be much more complex and dynamic for the next few hundred years than anyone can anticipate. Which brings us to our hosts. Why are we all here? Everyone in the room yesterday, we had a packed main stage, packed from all over the world. It was very clear that they're here for one reason, because there are countries thinking about the future very creatively with a focused vision. They will do whatever they have to do to bring innovation and investment and construction and technology and manufacturing and jobs to that country. That is why we're in Saudi now. And so, who will build narratives that align with the reality of what that country's vision is? Because we hear every country wants to sell to investors, please come, build here, invest here. And yet, very few countries have succeeded in doing that. So when I come here and I see a Lucid parked out front, and I see a Lucid police car, and I see Lucid black lanes, and I have friends who work at Lucid, I see very clearly Saudi is a country that sees the future and very aggressively is trying to build it. Build it by attracting investors, manufacturing, technology, startups, all of it. And so it remains to be seen whether the reality command that is unfolding now in Saudi will be matched by an equally powerful narrative command. I hope that my friends who are here in the audience who are Saudi will consider these elements that Saudi already possesses. There is, much like Tesla 11 years ago, a clear vision of the future. I find it very funny when critics say, oh, NEOM is behind schedule. It doesn't matter. The fact that it is even being attempted is something that one rarely sees anywhere on Earth in terms of commitment, investment. I mean, it's so ambitious that this can become the foundation of a compelling narrative for the future. And of course, there's location, there's scale, there's leadership, there's resources. All of these things are essential. But I believe that countries, nation states, that want to become bigger than they could ever possibly foresee now will have to deploy a narrative command strategy on a global stage. So thank you very much for your time. If anyone has any questions, I am miraculously ahead of time, which is unlike me. So anyone have any questions? My friend, do you have a microphone? Speak up and I'll repeat your question back to you.
Thank you very much. Is there any which failed? Oh, thank you. In terms of narrative commands, has anybody failed on that journey as a good case study?
Well, I'll speak inside the transportation vertical because my area of expertise. The most catastrophic narrative command failure, a big one, would be Cruise Automation, which is General Motors' self-driving division. So Cruise, they think they raised $12 billion, and they had some good technology, but they behaved as if they had narrative command when they did not. So I'll go back here for a moment up to, hang on a second. It's not going back, there we go. All right, so Cruise, you see it's dead today. Cruise, at best, had narrative superiority, at best. But they behaved as if they had command. They behaved as if they were immune to criticism and immune to any disaster. But the company literally crumbled overnight. They had a crash that was not initially their fault. They had partial responsibility for the crash that injured a pedestrian. And then they tried to cover it up. And this was exposed in the US media, which is the most aggressive of all media on Earth. And so this arrogance and this lack of understanding of their position on the pyramid led to a complete collapse of trust from the media to Cruise and their complete destruction within months. I mean, of annihilating $12 billion. It's unusual for this to occur. This almost occurred with Boeing. Almost. But Boeing survived it, which is impressive. That just goes to show you that if you are old enough and you're up against another company that's equally old and there's no disruptor to attack you, you can survive. An interesting footnote to history, in 1980, in the early 80s, Airbus released the first aircraft, commercial aircraft, with a full fly-by-wire system and what's called the flight envelope protection system. And on the first public demonstration flight, the plane, filled with journalists and their families and children, crashed and killed many of them. Today, it's forgotten, an absolute footnote, because Airbus did enough work to be transparent about what happened, that they survived it, and today they've achieved equality and parity with Boeing. So there are failures, not many. I think in the coming years, we're going to see one or more catastrophic failures on a global stage. So, one more question from this gentleman, then I've got to get off stage for my friends from Hydrogen E. Sir? You? Français. Thibault? Ça va? Go ahead.
Yeah, what are your top advices, top recommendation for founders and CEO in terms of owning their narrative in the space? You know, is it about allies? Is it about like owning the language? Is it about what are your top recommendations?
I would say you need to deploy no less than 3 of the components that Tesla did, and you should email me. We should have lunch. This is the best way. I have to go, my friends. I look forward to the next interview. Thank you so much.